Los Angeles, June 14, 1997, 7:42 p.m. A quiet office off Sunset Boulevard, lights still on long after most assistants have gone home. Outside, traffic hums. Inside, a phone rings on a polished desk once, twice, three times. No voicemail greeting interrupts it. No hand reaches out. The call is allowed to finish on its own. You can almost feel the tension in the room, not from anger, not from fear, but from restraint. This isn't a dramatic refusal. There's no slammed receiver, no raised voice, just absence. And in Hollywood, absence can be louder than any confrontation. The man who owns this office is one of the most dependable stars in the business. For more than a decade, he's been known as reachable. Easy. The kind of name producers drop into conversations because they assume the answer will be yes, or at least fast. He has built a reputation not just on talent but on availability. Tonight that reputation pauses. The phone stops ringing, the room stays silent. And somewhere across town, a producer glances at his watch and feels something unfamiliar: uncertainty. Hollywood runs on informal calls, not contracts, not meetings, calls, the just checking in, the quick favor, the friendly reach out that carries no paperwork but plenty of expectation. These calls are how pressure travels without ever announcing itself. They feel personal, casual, harmless. That's the trick. For years, this star has answered them all. Late-night calls, weekend calls, calls routed through assistants who already know to interrupt dinner. Each time, the same calculation runs silently in his head. If I don't answer, what does that say about me? Difficult. Grateful but not grateful enough, slipping. So he answers, he always has. Until now. What changes first isn't the industry, it's something internal. A subtle fatigue that doesn't announce itself as burnout. It arrives disguised as professionalism, as responsibility, as a sense that if he doesn't stay reachable, the machine will move on without him. But that belief that constant access equals relevance is one Hollywood quietly relies on. This night something cracks, not loudly, just enough. The call he lets ring isn't hostile, it isn't even urgent. That's what makes the moment dangerous, because ignoring a crisis can be explained, ignoring casual access cannot. He doesn't decide to take a break. He doesn't frame it as a career pause. There's no manifesto forming in his head. He simply lets the call end. And then something unexpected happens. Nothing. No fallout, no angry voicemail, no immediate consequence. The silence feels almost disappointing, like stepping off a curb and expecting traffic only to find an empty street. But Hollywood consequences are rarely immediate, they accumulate quietly. Over the next few weeks, similar calls come in. Some he answers through his agent, some he delays, some he never hears about at all. Without saying it out loud, a new rule begins to form: if it matters, it will survive distance. This is not arrogance, it's preservation. You have to understand the psychological trap he's stepping out of. Hollywood rewards the appearance of effortlessness. Being easy to work with is treated like a moral virtue. Stars who set boundaries are labeled complicated. Stars who don't are labeled reliable and then quietly overused. Availability becomes invisible labor. Every answered call is a micro-decision to keep the system comfortable. Every unreturned call introduces friction, and friction is what power systems notice. At first, the industry assumes it's temporary. He must be busy, on set, traveling, give it time, someone else will handle it. But time passes. Invitations begin routing through agents by default, conversations become more formal, calendars fill more slowly but with different weight. Fewer favors, more intention. What no one says out loud but everyone senses is that something has shifted. He hasn't withdrawn, he hasn't rebelled, he has simply stopped being casually accessible. And that changes how people speak to you. Producers prepare more carefully before reaching out, scripts arrive more polished, negotiations start at a different temperature. The tone moves from "can you help us out" to "we'd like to make this worth your while." This is the quiet math of Hollywood power. It doesn't respond to explanations, it responds to patterns. By not answering one informal call, he begins teaching the system a new way to approach him. Not through demands, not through urgency, through respect. But here, the unsettling part: he doesn't feel relief right away. There's guilt, A low-grade anxiety, the fear that silence will be misinterpreted as ego, the old reflex to pick up the phone still twitches in his hand. Conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. And then weeks later, something lands on his desk. A project he wasn't chasing, a role that assumes he has options, an offer that doesn't ask for favors, only interest. He realizes slowly that the calls he stopped answering weren't tests of his importance. They were tests of his availability. And he had been passing them for years. The industry doesn't punish him for stepping back, it recalibrates, quietly, cautiously, as if adjusting around a new gravitational center it didn't realize was forming. That single unanswered call doesn't announce a career pause, but it marks the beginning of one. A pause that won't look like retreat. A pause that will feel to Hollywood like distance. And distance in this town changes everything. The shift doesn't announce itself. It creeps in through tone changes, through pauses on the other end of the line, through assistants asking questions they never asked before. How flexible is he right now? Should we go through the agent? Is he available? Hollywood doesn't panic when a star stops answering calls, it studies the behavior carefully like a weather pattern. For years, being easy has been his unspoken currency, not weak, not submissive, just agreeable enough to keep the machinery smooth. Studios love predictability, they love stars who respond quickly, commit early, and don't complicate schedules with hesitation. What they don't love but quietly exploit is the psychological cost of that reliability. Because being easy means absorbing pressure silently, it means hearing disappointment disguised as friendliness. It means carrying the emotional labor of saying maybe when everyone expects yes. Over time, the star begins to feel less like a decision maker and more like a release valve. This is where many careers stall without anyone noticing. Projects stack up not because they're meaningful but because turning them down feels dangerous. Each declined call feels like a small betrayal. Each delayed response triggers the fear of being replaced by someone hungrier, faster, younger. The industry never says this out loud, it doesn't need to, the anxiety does the work for it. Our star feels it in his body first. A tension when the phone rings, a spike of alertness that never fully turns off, dinner conversations interrupted, vacations spent just checking in. The cost isn't exhaustion, it's erosion. Erosion of authority. Because the more accessible you are, the less your time appears valuable. Paradoxical but true, Hollywood respects boundaries it didn't create. The moment he starts routing calls through his agent consistently, something subtle but telling happens. Conversations slow down, not in a bad way, in a considered way. Scripts arrive with cover letters instead of assumptions. Meetings are scheduled instead of dropped into evenings. And yet inside he wrestles with doubt. You can almost hear it, am I being difficult now? Is this how careers cool off? This is the emotional pressure point few people talk about. The fear that self-preservation will be misread as arrogance, that silence will be mistaken for disinterest, that distance will be punished. But Hollywood doesn't punish distance. It punishes unpredictability. And what he's doing isn't unpredictable, it's consistent. Week after week the same pattern holds, he doesn't disappear, he doesn't lash out, he simply removes casual access. The calls that used to arrive with urgency now arrive with context. This is the psychological pivot, when the industry realizes it no longer owns your attention. At a studio dinner months later, someone jokes, half serious, "You're harder to get these days." He smiles, says nothing. Silence again. That silence does more than any explanation could, it reframes the entire relationship. He's no longer someone to be managed, he's someone to be approached. And here's the uncomfortable truth the industry rarely admits: stars who pause strategically don't lose power, they concentrate it. By stepping back, he forces others to decide what actually matters, which projects are worth effort, which conversations deserve formality, which offers can survive waiting. Some fall away immediately, that's the point. Others sharpen. What he's unknowingly doing is filtering his future, not through public statements but through response patterns. The work that remains is heavier, slower, more deliberate. The fear he once had that silence would make him invisible starts to feel inverted. He isn't less seen. He's less consumed. And Hollywood notices the difference. But the recalibration isn't finished yet, because there's one final test the industry always runs when a star pulls back, not to punish but to measure. It comes disguised as an opportunity that looks generous, but carries an old expectation. A call that assumes he'll break his new pattern. That moment is coming. And how he handles it will decide whether this pause becomes permanent or collapses back into availability. The call arrives on a Tuesday afternoon. Midweek, mid-budget, mid-expectation. It doesn't come directly to him, that's the first sign. It comes through his agent, framed carefully as an opportunity, delivered with just enough warmth to feel flattering. A role, solid, respectable, not a stretch, not a risk. The kind of project that used to land on his desk automatically and just as automatically get accepted. There's no deadline attached, no urgency expressed, but beneath the politeness is a familiar assumption he'll say yes. This is Hollywood's quiet test. When a star changes behavior, the industry doesn't confront it, it probes it. It sends something safe and watches the response, not to punish, but to see whether the old pattern can be reactivated. If he agrees quickly, the pause is dismissed as temporary. If he hesitates, the system adjusts. He reads the script that evening. You can almost see him at the table, pages spread out, the weight of familiarity pressing in. It's not bad, that's what makes it dangerous. It asks nothing new of him, it would keep him visible without changing anything. A few years ago, he wouldn't have thought twice. Now, something feels off, not with the project but with the expectation attached to it. The idea that his participation is assumed rather than earned, that his availability is still being tested, quietly. He doesn't decline immediately. He waits. That wait is everything. Days pass, the agent fields polite follow-ups, nothing aggressive, nothing revealing, just enough to feel the pressure humming beneath the surface. This is the moment many stars break. They reassure, they explain, they overcommunicate, they soften the delay so the industry doesn't feel rejected. In doing so, they give back the very leverage they momentarily gained. He doesn't. Instead, when he finally responds, it's measured, appreciative, non-committal. He asks questions that weren't expected, about the director's vision, about scheduling flexibility, about why this role needs him specifically. The shift is subtle but seismic. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about whether he'll fit into the project. It's about whether the project fits him. That inversion doesn't happen often in Hollywood, and when it does, people notice. The producer's tone changes, enthusiasm sharpens into justification. What was once assumed now has to be articulated. The offer sweetens slightly, not in money alone but in creative terms. This is the hidden currency of distance. By not rushing, he forces others to reveal their priorities. He sees which projects truly value him and which simply expect him. He ultimately passes. Quietly, cleanly, no drama. The reaction isn't anger. It's recalculation. For the first time, the industry registers that he's not just pausing between projects, he's redefining his relationship to them, that this isn't a phase or a scheduling issue, it's a boundary. And boundaries, once proven, tend to hold. In the months that follow, offers change shape. Fewer come in, but they arrive with more thought behind them. He notices something else too. When his name is mentioned in rooms he isn't in, it carries more weight, not less. Scarcity does that. Hollywood doesn't openly reward restraint, but it organizes itself around it. It begins to treat his time as finite, his interest as conditional. The pause stops feeling like a risk and starts feeling like control. And yet there's a personal cost. Without the constant noise of calls and quick decisions, he's left alone with questions he's been postponing for years. About legacy, about why he kept saying yes, about whether his career has been driven by choice or momentum. This is the part the industry never sees. The internal quiet. Because stepping back doesn't just change how others treat you, it changes how you hear yourself. Without urgency constantly intruding, his instincts return slower, clearer, harder to ignore. And they lead him somewhere unexpected. Not toward retirement. Not toward disappearance. but toward a kind of authority he's never held before. One that doesn't need to announce itself. But that authority will soon be tested again, not by a role but by absence itself, by how long he's willing to remain unavailable before the industry fully rewrites its expectations. That moment is approaching. And when it arrives, the career pause will stop being temporary. It will become legacy-defining. The calendar thins. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to and say he's fading. Just enough that the gaps become noticeable. A year passes with fewer releases bearing his name, interviews become rarer, red carpets feel optional instead of mandatory. When he does appear, it's deliberate, contained within projects that feel chosen, not inherited. Hollywood starts telling a different story about him. Not publicly, privately. He's selective now. He's in a different phase. He doesn't chase. These phrases sound neutral, even complimentary, but what they signal is something deeper. The industry has stopped expecting access, and expectation is the real engine of power here. Once access is no longer assumed, everything recalibrates. Studios don't rush to call him for mid-tier projects anymore. They wait until something substantial justifies the effort. His name isn't used casually in pitch meetings, it's saved, deployed carefully. This is how absence turns into reputation. The emotional texture of his career changes too. Without the constant low-level obligation, he rediscovers patience. Scripts are read slowly, meetings are fewer but longer, decisions are made with a sense of alignment rather than relief. He's no longer choosing between options. He's choosing whether to choose at all. What's striking is that the industry doesn't interpret this as weakness, quite the opposite. In Hollywood's unspoken hierarchy, those who can afford to wait are assumed to have leverage. And leverage invites deference. You can see it in small moments. A producer apologizing for interrupting his weekend, a studio executive asking, not assuming, availability months in advance. These gestures aren't about politeness, they're about recognition. The pause has taught the system how to treat him. But there's a deeper psychological shift underway, one that rarely gets discussed because it doesn't show up in headlines. For the first time in years, his sense of identity loosens its grip on output. He's no longer measuring himself by what he's producing or accepting. The need to stay visible fades, the fear of being forgotten recedes. He realizes something unsettling. Much of his previous urgency wasn't driven by ambition. It was driven by fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of missing momentum, fear of being replaced. Stepping back exposes that fear, and then slowly drains it of power. This is the paradox of Hollywood pressure. The more you respond to it, the more it owns you. The moment you stop responding reflexively, it loses its leverage. And yet the pause isn't comfortable. There are nights when the silence feels heavy, when the absence of calls feels like emptiness instead of freedom, when he wonders whether he's overcorrected, whether distance has become detachment. This is where many stars return prematurely. They miss the affirmation, the sense of being needed, the hum of relevance. He doesn't. Instead, he lets the discomfort sit. He learns to tolerate the gap between projects without filling it with obligation. In doing so, he creates something rarer than demand. He creates gravity. Projects begin orbiting him differently. They come with longer development cycles, with creative control, with an understanding that he won't be rushed. The pause, once a defensive maneuver, becomes a signal. A signal that he's not operating on the industry's clock anymore. But Hollywood always reacts fully only when proof arrives, not promises, not patterns. Proof. And that proof comes in the form of a single project, one that wouldn't have existed without the pause, and that redefines how his career will be remembered. That project is coming. And when it does, it will confirm what the industry has been slowly realizing all along. He didn't step back because he was losing power. He stepped back because he was consolidating it. The project arrives quietly. No fanfare, no rush. It isn't announced through trades first. It's discussed in private rooms among people who understand timing, the kind of project that would never have been offered to the version of him who answered every call. Because this one assumes patience. It assumes leverage. It assumes he might say no. The script is ambitious, uncomfortable in places, structurally slower than what studios usually chase. It asks for something other than reliability, it asks for presence. When he accepts, the reaction is telling, not celebration, relief. Relief that the pause meant something, that the distance wasn't disappearance, that his silence had been storing intention, not retreat. Hollywood adjusts fully only after certainty replaces doubt. This acceptance provides that certainty. The narrative shifts. He's no longer framed as a star who slowed down. He's reframed as one who waited, who moved deliberately, who didn't scramble to stay relevant but allowed relevance to come to him differently. This is how legacy pivots, without speeches, without declarations. Behind the scenes, the implications ripple outward. Younger actors notice, agents adjust how they advise clients, executives rethink how often they lean on informal access. Because his pause exposed a truth the industry prefers not to confront, constant availability benefits the system more than the individual. By refusing to be always reachable, he demonstrated a different model, one where authority is maintained not through dominance but through selectivity. The emotional center of this shift is restraint. Restraint from explaining. Restraint from reassuring. Restraint from filling silence. That restraint does something powerful. It forces others to project value onto the space you leave behind. And in Hollywood, projection often matters more than reality. When the project finally releases, the coverage focuses on the work, not the gap that preceded it. The pause is treated as context, not concern, as a chapter, not a question mark. But those inside the industry know better. They know that the most important decision wasn't the role he took. It was the calls he stopped answering years earlier. Those unanswered calls retaught Hollywood how to approach him, how to respect his time, how to understand his absence as intentional rather than accidental. The career pause, once a personal boundary, becomes a professional signal. And that signal outlives the project. Even after momentum returns, even after offers increase again, the pattern holds. Communication stays filtered, access remains controlled, silence remains an option. This is the final transformation. Not from star to legend, but from participant to reference point. When his name comes up now, it isn't attached to urgency, it's attached to patience, to gravity, to the idea that power doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through what you no longer make yourself available for. And that understanding, the one Hollywood takes years to absorb, is what quietly redefines a career. Not the projects chosen, but the pressure resisted.